work. It's your standard think tank event. Andrew, my colleagues, are going to talk about our report for 5 minutes or so, which, given the complexity of the topic, is a challenge in and of itself. Let's see how he does. And then we will come to Dame Hilary, Joanne Pitt, and Chris Naylor, who will give their responses and reflections. And then we'll come to the audience for Q&A. Just to quickly run through our panel, not that they need any introduction, but I'll give one. We're delighted to have Baroness Hilary Armstrong, one of the great reforming ministers under the last new Labour government, and also chair of the new Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods as well. So you're once again giving back service on the important issues of how we strengthen our local communities, and of which local government's financial sustainability is a key part of that. Chris Naylor, Director of Inner Circle Consulting and former Chief Executive of Barking and Dagenham Council, and has written a fantastic pamphlet for Demos earlier on this year as well, about how we can reform public services, and some of his experiences in Barking Dagenham, which I will recommend you take a look at. And Joanne Pitt, Senior Policy Manager at SIPFA, who are, again, not only a fantastic partner for the Public Services Network, which we have, but have also been doing some fantastic work looking at, obviously, this very topic of how we create a sustainable financial environment for local authorities, and some of the reforms and options that we might be able to consider. And of course, my colleague Andrew Phillips, who's Senior Researcher at Demos, and as I say, co-authored the report. So Andrew, I'm going to come to you and ask you to set the scene for us, and lay out some of the report's recommendations and findings.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm speaking into this microphone, which does nothing in the room, but this is purely for the online audience, just so that people know and think if you're thinking that isn't doing anything, you're correct. But it is for the online audience. It's beneficial. So yeah, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the report that we published today. So I'm going to cover kind of 3 points. First, we argue that there is currently confusion about the purpose of local government in England. Second, we propose a new vision, which we call liberated local government. And third, we suggest reforms to the finance system to enable local authorities to fulfil that vision. Our paper does propose significant changes, and not everyone will agree with this, but we hope it helps to move the conversation forward, because reforms are urgently needed. Many local authorities across the country do fantastic work every day in leading their local areas, partnering with local communities, supporting vulnerable people. Because our paper focuses on the finance system, inevitably it focuses on the problems. But our proposals are designed to build on the existing strengths of councils and to liberate them from unrealistic financial demands currently placed on them. The kind of proximate causes of the crisis in councils' finances are well known, but we argue that there's a deeper underlying cause, which is confusion about the purpose of local government. We identify in the paper 4 different purposes which have been suggested over the years, which are first, local democracy, second, place leadership, third, local economic growth, and fourth, public service delivery. And today, the last of those, public service delivery, is crowding out everything else. And so for this reason, councils are often described as the delivery arm of central government. And typically, central government wants uniformity across the country, and that leads to national legislation with national requirements that all councils have to meet. That in turn leads to significant spending pressures, especially in what we call demand-led high needs services. So the 4 most significant are adult social care, children's social care, homelessness and temporary accommodation, and the SEND system. Now, these are critical public services for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, but because councils are legally obligated to provide those services, they're being forced to cut spending on everything else. Hence, cuts to libraries, to fixing potholes. Even this year's Christmas lights have been a casualty. And it's those things, the condition of their local area, that people really notice, and are making people feel that the country around them is kind of getting worse. So to address this crisis, we need a new vision for local government. To quote Sir Michael Lyons, who conducted an inquiry into local government in the 2000s, reform of the local government finance system should not be seen in isolation, but must be part of the process of empowering the kind of local government that we want. We agree, and so in our paper we set out a new vision for liberated local government. We suggest that the purpose of local economic growth, which I mentioned, should be fulfilled primarily by combined authorities, and we think that local authorities should focus on those first 2 purposes we identified. So local democracy, and place leadership. So local democracy means ensuring councils have genuine autonomy to respond to the priorities of local residents, whether that's filling in potholes or funding youth services or whatever. Place leadership, that means building social capital and trust in communities, providing social infrastructure like parks and libraries and community centres, convening partners across public, private and third sectors. And only local government, elected by local people and with a holistic concern for place, is able to deliver those two purposes. But most councils can't fulfil this vision today. They're too tightly constrained by funding services mandated by central government. And so we propose that central government should establish new local institutions called public service trusts. Public service trusts would take on legal and commissioning powers for those demand-led high needs services, which I mentioned. Those services are national priorities. And so public service trusts would be funded directly by central government to reflect that they are national priorities. In turn, public service trusts would be responsible for using that funding to commission local services. The trusts would be governed by strategic boards, including local authority representatives, and the trusts would commission local authorities to deliver services, as today, alongside BCSE and private sector organisations, as also happens today. So we're really talking about shifting fiscal responsibility here, is the key point of the trusts. They would also provide a foundation for reform. Reform is incredibly difficult when councils are so financially constrained. So having public service trusts with being financially stable, that would help to pursue reforms like pooling resources to stop private providers making excess profits, to prioritise investment in prevention and early intervention, which is desperately needed. Council tax would no longer be used to fund social care in our vision. And so that means councils would have £30 billion collectively to really invest in their local areas and to fulfil their purpose of local democracy and place leadership. To move beyond sticking plaster solutions, we think we need a clear sense of what a good system looks like. And our proposed changes would liberate local authorities to focus on those purposes. Public service trusts, on the other hand, would provide fiscal stability that we need for essential public services for vulnerable people, as well as a foundation for much needed reform. But the alternative is a future in which spending on neighbourhood services continues to be cut year by year, and more councils have to declare effective bankruptcy. So politically, if the government wants to see potholes fixed, if it wants to see high streets improved, if it wants to see the social fabric of communities repaired, structural reforms to local government finances are needed. Thanks, and I will pass back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think that was just over 5 minutes, so you've very much stuck to the brief there. Well done. And I was a very bad chair telling everybody else about the microphones. Andrew's done that, but yes, we need to keep holding those up. Thank you very much for that overview. I'm going to go to Dame Hilary, to yourself first, and just ask for your reflections, not just on the report, of course, and some of the ideas in it, but just your general reflections on, if you were a new minister going in to this government and you were looking at this particular challenge, what some of your instincts and direction would be.
Hello, everybody. This is one of the most complex areas in government, and we've already heard some interesting ideas that I think ought to be out there on the table and discussed. I'm not sure about some aspects of that, and I'll come back to that. But I think that we have struggled for generations in this country with how we get a system of devolved government alongside a system of national government where they're able to be distinguished not just by policymakers but by the public. One of the frustrations in government was always, when I was local government minister, that people didn't vote in local elections around what was happening locally unless things were going very wrong in that locality, but they voted on national issues. And that was always a real frustration, but that was also a reflection of how much central government activity and work with local government dominated the agenda. But there are other issues too, and that is that we're such a crowded nation. We don't have the vast areas that other European countries in particular have, where you can really feel and see the different localities and appreciate that. In this country, we get obsessed with postcode lottery and public services. But if you're not getting the same as you hear they're getting next door or over there, and what the Mail and the Sun tell you they're getting over there, you feel you're being disadvantaged and discriminated against. And I've always felt that that's a really big issue in our society that we often don't take on. We don't have a go at people arguing that their services have got to be the same, although they want and to have great pride in where they live. So I do think the idea of trying to separate that out a bit is very important. We have traditionally allowed local government to raise money through property taxes, essentially. Council tax and even business rates were often based on a valuation system. And as I can tell you, when I was housing minister, that was what struck me most of all. It ain't the same in Darlington or somewhere in London. And as somebody who did that journey every week for nearly 30 years, I can tell you it's very different. And house prices and what people think about their housing is very different. I'll tell you, just at the beginning of COVID, I sold a beautiful 1850s stone built house in an old mining town that had been built for the doctor with his surgery, etc., etc. It had 5 bedrooms, a cellar, all the rest of it, 170 grand. You couldn't buy a garage for that where I'm living in London now. So in the Northeast, I always paid more council tax than I ever did in London. And that wasn't just because it was a bigger house in the Northeast. It was because in the Northeast, you can't raise through council tax what you can in a London borough, because even in the poor London boroughs, there are very big houses that attract big valuations. And in the Northeast, the majority of properties are in lower bands because they're terraced 2-story, sometimes even only 1-story properties traditionally. So, we've never got this right. My concerns on the report are, would this give local government really enough to generate real demand in local government? I understand the idea of the liberated local authorities, but they have to have a feeling that they can do things. And I think one of the reasons we've had real problems in some councils is it just isn't attractive to be a councillor anymore. Who the hell's going to give up their career, in essence, which is what they do, to go on and not be able to really make the decisions they want to make, or I might say attract a pension, even as leader of the council. I introduced pensions for leaders because in reorganising the way councils worked, you really needed someone to be able to give a real commitment to leading a council, but that was got rid of very quickly by the coalition government. And I think that that's a real problem. But I'm interested in the public service trust idea, but I want to be sure that it does what you talked about, Andrew. One example, children, it's not just that all the services of high need are now all that councils can afford, it is that they're into real crisis management of those services. If you think about children's services, what we really need is a lot of more early intervention and so on, which then reduces the crisis. If we'd still had Sure Start, we'd have fewer kids needing to go in now at 14 and 15 into the care system. And Leeds, bless them, demonstrated that, because Leeds maintained a lot of their children's centres, I have to say, until earlier this year, when it's become too difficult even for them. But they are the one authority I can point you to who have reduced the number of children coming to care. There may be others, but I know about Leeds. And what I'm concerned about is that if those prevention things are separated, now they may or they may not be by a public service trust and a local authority, but we have to make sure that one follows the other. I actually went to the Treasury, and I always feel guilty about this now, because is this why they did payment by results? But I went to the Treasury to argue when I was doing social exclusion that, for example, the care system, if a child got into the criminal justice system, that was actually a good thing for the local authority, because the local authority then lost the responsibility to pay for them. And I said to the Treasury, you should do this on a long term, and that's the other thing I was going to say about this. We need long term solutions. If you did this on the long term, then you would look when the child was 24. Did it have, was it living, were they living on their own? Did they have a relationship? Very important. And did they have a job? And if they did, the local authority would be rewarded. If they didn't, and they were in the criminal justice system, the local authority should pay a penalty. Now, that would have been a very radical way of actually dealing with making sure you did the prevention work early and consistently to make sure you didn't end up with a real problem ending up in the criminal justice system. So for me, it's how do you organize what we need as local interest and commitment to these issues. Can't solve it without that, but in a way in which the recognition is you put the money in over a longer term period for prevention and early intervention, and you actually are able to show your local community how that makes a difference. So I'm not really saying how we absolutely reform finance. I'm just saying these are the sorts of principles that this debate has got to think about, talk about, and find a way forward on.
Thank you, Hilary. Some really interesting thoughts there. You're going to get a lot of radical ideas thrown out in this debate, I think. But it's, as you say, Hilary, it's really important that we confront some of those. Chris, I'm going to come to you and ask for your perspective. And of course, you bring that kind of direct experience in trying to tackle many of the issues which we highlight in the paper, which is essentially, how do you, as Hilary quite rightly said, improve outcomes, improve life chances for those people particularly those living in some of the most deprived areas, and how do we create a kind of financial model to achieve that? So really interested to get your perspective from the from your days, not just at Barking and Dagenham, but at kind of in local government more broadly.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me today. It's a real privilege to be sharing the platform with such esteemed colleagues. So thank you, and also for bearing with me. I'm on holiday with my family in France for half term, so such is the wonder of modern technology, and also France's rural broadband. I'm able to do that today. So I thought it was a fascinating report. I want to thank the two Andrews and the wider team for producing it, and for mixture and metaphor here, to kind of tearing the plaster off what is some of the mess of the local government finance system that we've been contending with, as Hilary said, for decades now. But I think yet again, Demos has proved its worth in sort of demonstrating the truth about the reality of public services in the modern world, and some of the stark choices that we face. So I think, if nothing else, thank you for doing that with this report. I was going to say three things, if I may, and I think I'll sort of touch upon, and there's a fairly high degree of commonality with what Hilary was just saying, actually. But the three things I was going to say, one, I think, without doubt, the central proposition of this report, which I'd be kind of curious, actually, Andrew, is when you were writing this or when you started the work, whether or not you thought this might be the outcome. It's not. It doesn't feel to me to be the obvious outcome of a report on local government finance, but actually, I thought the presentation of the report was very compelling. But the central proposition of the public service trust is definitely bold, but it's also logical. And the fact that some people have no doubt been upset by it or have found it quite challenging is probably not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that sort of upsetting people is a good thing generally, but I think it sort of demonstrates that there's, this is a big response to a big challenge, and I think, as you say in the closing remarks of the report, things can't carry on as they are. And it struck me the other day that we're kind of about 8 weeks away now from hitting the quarter-way mark of this century, which is a bit depressing if you think about it. But does anyone really think that the pattern of public services we've got today will be the same as they are today as we enter the halfway point? I just don't think that is a plausible proposition, and therefore it takes ideas like this, I think, to kind of shift the debate on and to consider what those plausible alternatives might be. Now, just let's just take as read for a moment that the idea of a trust is the right one. The report talks about them having a primarily strategic function. In my view, I don't see any particular reason why they couldn't take on delivery responsibilities for those acute services. So the point at which people have hit the threshold, and I'll come back to Hilary's point about prevention in a second, but the point at which people have hit the threshold, it's entirely logical that if government have determined what that threshold should be, that they should have some skin in the game of bearing the risk of taking on the cost of that. I think if you start to pull that thread, then I don't see any particular reason why those trusts would need to be coterminous with existing borough boundaries. I had as some of you in the room may know, I spent some time in Birmingham at the start of the pandemic. The Children's Trust in Birmingham, rated good by Ofsted, serves a population of just over 1.2 million people, serves them well by all accounts. Were that model to be transposed, say, onto London, a trust could deliver on behalf of 5 to 6 London boroughs, or take the part of the world where Hilary's from. A trust half the size of Birmingham's could serve the needs of the people of Stockton, Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Cleveland, and Darlington. Just reminding myself of the boroughs up there. Pub quiz. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a good thing, but it's just it's a sort of factual representation of how things are. And of course, to get to that model of public service trusts would require some heavy lifting in relation to business rate schemes, possibly the legal framework in relation to the role of the statutory director of children's services. But to some extent, like almost all solutions are going to be complicated. So the question really is, like, which version of complicated do we want to go for, and sort of take it in our stride. I think the question that I found fascinating in the report, actually, and made me think quite a bit, was, especially being in France, where I think the answer to this question is really clear, actually, but what is local government for as we go through this complicated and sort of challenging century? I think first and foremost it's about the good life and enabling people to live a good life. We experience day-to-day life in the places in which we live, and those are things that can bring us joy. They are quite mundane and practical things, like getting our bins emptied and being able to transport ourselves around. But they're also the places where opportunities are afforded to people. I grew up in Rotherham in South Yorkshire in the 1980s, and although it's a little bit kind of glib and tries to say this, it was the public realm that transformed my life. It was things that in my locality. I think I'd go to Sheffield, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a year. I think I've visited Barnsley once in the 18 years I lived in Rotherham. Do you know what I mean? I think I went to London twice, both on school trips to the Science Museum. Like, my life was like determined by the place I lived. But so for all kind of the sort of, I don't know, Billy Elliot of local government stories that you can push out there are also many people who experience structural barriers that are kind of created and manifest in the locations that they live. So the point I suppose I'm rambling towards here is that if the true role of local government is to kind of discern and arbitrate the good life on behalf of the people in their area and to be advocates for those citizens and be on their side, then I think it follows, I think as Hilary was saying, that they also need to be the engine room of endeavours to maximise opportunities for people, but also to prevent them experiencing harm and barriers. And I think in this context, let's just imagine, for example, that we are bought into the idea of public service trust. Their boundaries, as Hilary was saying, the boundaries between what they do and what local authorities do would need to be very, very carefully demarcated. In my mind, they would be best placed to manage and support people who've hit a statutory threshold, but the magic happens in supporting people before they get anywhere close to that process. And I think if through this regime, money can be saved or better utilised, and then used to recapitalise the local states, local authorities to fulfil that role of understanding what the good life means for the people they're serving, and to essentially be in the vanguard of prevention, then that I think would be a good thing. That could be the superpower of local authorities now and in the future, and certainly I think something that could win hearts and minds, as well as be a good thing generally. The final point I'd make, and this is a sort of slightly controversial one, and it's very much a thought in progress, so I'm not entirely sure I'll agree with my own sentence by the time I've got to the end of it, but it is this. I think if we are going to put the amount of effort that would be required as a nation into the determination of these trusts and the heavy lifting that would be required to make them happen, I do think we should ask alongside that the question, what are children's services for? And I say that having worked in and amongst those services now for the best part of my adult life. And over the last 20 years, for very, very good reasons in this country, we've got a very highly regulated, a very clear model of risk assessment and risk management for children who are perceived to be at risk of harm. I think now would be the question to just ask ourselves very gently, have children benefited from that regime? Are the adults that have been a product of that regime, are they living better lives than they would have done otherwise? And if not, why? I think I often find myself instinctively unpersuaded that we've hit the high watermark of support for children, and that being an outstanding children's services department is kind of like it. No, I'm not going to say what I was about to say, but I think I don't think the answer to that question is yes. So I would like to understand the lived experience of people who've been through the care system. I'd like to see that in comparative facts with nations similar to ours who go about supporting vulnerable children in a different way. And before we build a public service trust or some form of other manifestation of those services in the future, I'd want us to be absolutely certain and assured that we had the right approach moving forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm the chair, so I can break things up a little bit. I thought there's been a couple of interesting points about prevention, and I guess absolutely that was something which I think Andrew and I were thinking about as we were doing the report, and we also were drawing on another piece of work we did with local trust, who in the room today as well, called Preventive State last year, and we got some further papers coming out on this. But if you want to get prevention right, a lot of that is around the kind of, Chris, what you very eloquently laid out in terms of the good life. It's the social infrastructure, the social capital, the cultural capital, which local authorities can create. And I think what we're trying to get to, and I think there are conversations with local authorities, but also with experts in the room, is how do you get local government back to being the engine room for that kind of activity? Because it's so well placed to shape that, and the preventative impact of that work can be huge. Hilary, as you were saying, in terms of, for example, looking at the criminal justice system, if you can provide pathways for people to develop rich, meaningful educational opportunities, cultural opportunities, employment opportunities, you can really, you can drive long-term outcomes. And I think it's this wrestling of the challenge at the moment, which I think the dilemma we have at the moment, which is, I feel, certainly in this work, that we all want local authorities to focus on that, but there's this huge burdens, unsustainable financial burdens on, as you say, Chris, people hitting the statutory kind of eligibility criteria, which is just weighing the system down and means it can't deliver on that properly. So absolutely, I think we're fully aligned with yourself and Hilary on that commitment to prevention, and that's very much how we'd like to explore going forward. What more can we do to put local authorities as the drivers for that preventative agenda, and then find other mechanisms potentially to deliver the reactive and the acute services, which are critically important. They always will be important, but are they really always best placed in the structures they are now? But some people would say you need to join the two up. And, as you said, Chris, as well, the blurring the lines, and we don't want to get in a situation where there's too much overlap, but equally there are often good cases to make that you can intervene earlier through effective provision of those services as well. So it's a challenge, but some really interesting thoughts there. Joanne, I guess, to get your perspective and your thoughts, and I know SIP's done a lot of work on this particular challenge, so it'd be great to get your experiences and views.
Thank you. Yeah, delighted to be here. It's great. We're doing a lot of work with Demos at the moment, so it's been really interesting and intellectually stimulating. So it's been great. It's been a real grown-up conversation around the challenges around finance, and I think that that's been one of the things that this type of report has been really beneficial. I think, as Chris was saying, we need to challenge ourselves. It's been a long while since we have been able to move this agenda forward, fair funding review, all of that. It just hasn't kept moving, and we're asking for more and more money, which is understandable, but that doesn't look as though the budget is going to sort of is going to fulfill that part. So we was a part of the round table, and as Chris was saying, that there wasn't unanimous agreement about the move forward, but I think what there was a real positive discussion in the room about the need for change. So and I'm very much of the fact that we need to ask and explore and challenge every possible thought if we're to move this agenda forward. And if we don't ask the difficult questions, then we're not going to get forward with any of those answers. I think probably SIPFA does have quite a number of challenges with the idea of public sector, public service trusts. I mean, I don't think that would be probably a surprise. But what we are doing is really welcoming those challenges and making sure that we can get that conversation and explore why we don't think that might work, and what those debates are. Because I think that when we talk, and hopefully there'll be some good questions coming out from the audience in a couple of minutes after I've finished, and that's at that point we have those richest conversations and the gems that come through and are captured as part of that discussion. So I suppose I wanted to make maybe 3 brief points before we open it up to a broader conversation. And mine really are around 3 points. One is about role, which I know has been explored, but I will make a comment about that. One, unsurprisingly, because we're from SIPFA, is about money. So you wouldn't be surprised if I wasn't going to mention that. And the third one is about reform. So that's really what we're going to talk about. So whilst we might not agree with all of the things that are suggested in the report, what we do know is that currently the system doesn't work, and it absolutely needs to be considered. That role of what we want from our local authorities needs to be challenged. What is it we are expected to deliver, and how are we going to be able to manage that? When we talk about funding and we talk about financial stability, that's really, really difficult if you don't actually know what the local authority is about, what people are expecting it. I think most of the people in the street, they don't really even know the difference between council and district. They think the district, they don't know that the person who collects the bins doesn't deal with the waste. And to be honest, they don't. And should they? Absolutely, Harry. Should they know that? So it's about what it is and the role of government. So there's an concept of form follows function, and I really think that we need to think about that. What is the form of local government? What do we want it to be? Not just now, not just in 5 years' time, but in 40 years' time, because the debts that are being built up are going to be paid by those people in 40 years' time. So I think we have a real responsibility to do that. I don't have the answers, and I wouldn't profess to be having the answers, but this is a fantastic opportunity to explore those sorts of questions. The second point that I wanted to make was about money. So, yeah, we've all got the Barnet. If any of those, I won't embarrass you by asking who's actually read the report in the audience, but Barnet of Doom is in there, and there's lots of talk about the gaps. Certainly, the gaps in funding from a number of reports. I think your report is talking about by 2029-30, you've got £11 billion worth of gap. So whatever the amount of money we're talking about, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And there are authorities that are facing that, but there's authorities that are currently in the midst of all of this. We've got a lot of authorities that are on exceptional financial support. They're being given the sticking plaster, as you mentioned in the title. Personally, not sure whether it's exceptional and not sure how supportive exceptional financial support actually is, because quite often they have to come back for it. But, we do need to find these things, and we need to find long-term solutions. I'm sure somebody will mention the SEND challenges, and that we are, pushing a lot of these down the road. So again, links back to that first conversation about what the role is, and it'll link back to the third point about reform. Should give Pierre a plug for the National Audit Report, which was out the other day. Really, really good report on SEND and the crisis in SEND. So we do need to sort out the funding. I've sort of read the report about the trusts, and I do have a slight concern that we are shifting financial responsibility, and I totally understand that, because at the moment central government can look and say, well, actually it's local government that aren't very good at managing their money around adult social care, and so and local government have to accept that, because that's in their remit. Following on from the trust, I can totally understand that would then not be their responsibility. Whilst that's all well and good, my concern, and it leads on to my third point, is that just because they have got financial responsibility doesn't mean that its finances are going to improve, and we have to do that. And links in with Chris's comment very specifically about making sure that the money, so just by nobody, I don't believe, benefits if we just create an extra layer of bureaucracy, and that we put that into and then say, oh well, as long as it's central government, doesn't matter, because it does matter. It doesn't matter. We can't afford it anymore. So that leads on, I suppose, to my third and final point about reform. Yes, absolutely, reform is needed. Now, this is adding another layer of, might be considered to be adding another layer of bureaucracy. I mean, this isn't something, you're surprised that I would comment on, because I sent you an email, but there is a fear that there is an additional layer of bureaucracy. We have a really complicated system. If you think about the complexities, as Hilary was talking about, not just within local government, you've now got combined authorities, you've got the ICBs, you've got all the NHS links, really, really complicated system. So if we're adding another layer, we really have an obligation to take something out and simplifying it. I sort of reminds me of when I'm telling my daughter and she bought something else, I say, well, you've got to get something, you've got to take something out your wardrobe before you put it in. So I think that there is a real importance about simplifying as part of that. And then when you've got a commissioning agent, there are issues about transparency, accountability that need to be addressed, the governance and who's on the board and how those decisions are made, how they are accountable for those decisions, what happens when, if something goes wrong. All of that is essential, absolutely essential for any sort of, not just this type of reform, but any reform to take place. But we're accepting that the problem that we are trying to solve is really complex and hugely interconnected, which is why people haven't wanted to touch it for a very long while. It's in the too difficult box. I think we also have to support current government's outcome-based missions approach, because essentially that mission-led, if we lean into those missions and that mission-led approach, I think that there are certainly solutions that can come from that, working in partnership and working across the current silos. So I think just to summarise it, I suppose this this is a really good report. It's making us sit up, making us think, making us really question what we want and what we know. It's great to see everyone in the room, and it's the first step along a long journey. But we definitely need to take those first steps, because if we don't, the future does look quite bleak.
Thank you very much, and some great contributions from all of our panel there. Before I open up to the audience, I'm just going to go just quickly around the panel, just a few reflections based on what you said. And I guess I'll kind of go in reverse order, Joanne, so I'm going to come to you first, because you're still warmed up, I'm sure, from your own comments. Just thinking about one of the things we talk about in the report, I guess, is around kind of pooling of financial risk as well. And there have been some efforts to see if there are kind of more that could be done in kind of collaborations across different local authorities, thinking particularly around children's care, for example, and some of the regional partnerships which Labour is looking at exploring. And we have had regimes, and there still is one operating in London around business rates pooling, and so on, trying to help some of the both on the service delivery side and on the income and revenue generating side. Is there more that could be done, do you think, to try and strengthen that kind of approach to risk pooling and sharing of responsibility between local authorities, or is that a bit of a non-starter? Because I guess sometimes when we were looking at this piece of work, there is a little bit of you simply just aggregate the system together, it can kind of be more responsible. But I guess your point on there being not enough money in the system at all, does that just really kind of divert the problem away?
Yeah, I think the challenges around pooling, and this is what we saw when we did the business rate pooling, is those that are in a good position don't really want to be pooled with those that are much weaker, and so there's always whilst we're public sector orientated, there is that, and you can understand that. But I do think that particularly around pressures, that we could see some sort of support, because it doesn't take a lot of because going to the children's services, demand-led service, it doesn't take many really high dependent children to really start to make an enormous financial difference to your budget. And and that could be because you've got a family in your location. It's just the way that it fell. And some local authorities that we're aware of that are really up against it are looking at exceptional financial support. They are that close that it wouldn't take more than sort of 4 children in that category to put them into a position where they are financially not stable. So I think at that point, there is an opportunity to look at how the risk can be borne across the sector, and you probably in exactly the same way. If you look at some of the sort of homelessness on the south coast, again, I think it's Hastings, isn't it? That it's no secret they were in the newspaper saying about the sort of demands around their homeless, and again, because of their location. So I do think that that there is certainly a discussion to be had, and maybe that goes back to the sort of concept of the structure of those organisations, and would a larger structure be something that would provide greater stability, because it would be able to share slightly more in the ups and downs. But yes, I think some of that risk is really challenging, and also because you don't know when that risk will occur in some of those demand-led services.
Perfect. Thanks, Joanne. Chris, I mean, obviously embarking in Dagenham, creating community solutions there. You've actually done a lot of work on and thinking around reforming public services. Do we get a bit too het up talking about some of the structures and the kind of the way and the methods by which we're delivering those public services? Because I guess what you've shown in Barking and Dagenham was that within the existing system, you could make quite bold and imaginative and creative reforms. And similarly, we know we do a lot of work here looking at Gateshead at Demos. So Demos has done a lot of work looking at Gateshead and some of the methods that they've pursued up there. So do you think that, one of the arguments we make in the report is we do think you need to fix the funding models to enable reform to happen. But do you think that's right, Chris? Or actually, is there more that could be done within existing models? And are we making too much of that as a factor?
I would say yes and no is the answer to that question. So let's start with the yes, we are making too much of it part of it. I think there are a number of authorities recently, and in the case of Barking, not so recently actually now, sort of 10 years ago, where their backs are so hard up against the wall that they are thinking the unthinkable and doing quite remarkable things, because when the need arises, if the counterfactual is bankruptcy, or in the case of Barking and Dagenham, people voting for the BNP, it tends to alter your perspective on risk, and things that felt unpalatable suddenly are a lot less palatable than the less unpalatable than the counterfactual. So, and I think in that context, so long as there's both political alignment and alignment with the kind of key sort of civil servants, then you can do remarkable things. I think the problem with that analysis is that that relies on quite a few things to go right, and as soon as people start talking about heroic leadership or systems leadership or those sorts of things, I always worry, because those are the sorts of contexts that sometimes will work and sometimes won't. So I think they're useful opportunities to explore what can and can't be done, but I don't think they're the sustainable solution. So let me just put that into a bit of perspective. I still think the fundamental problem we have is that we are operating a series of public services that were essentially designed by our great-great-grandparents to deal with the issues of the early to mid 20th century, essentially a very needs-led model of public services, which was based on a not unreasonable proposition that from time to time people would fall on hard times and the state would be there to kind of put them back on their feet, and of course a whole set of other wider contextual circumstances like a growing industrial economy, full employment, basic needs met in terms of housing. A lot of those things just aren't true anymore, and therefore I think a starting assumption that we work within the structures that we've got will probably end up with, albeit with lots of nice reports written and great case studies and all the rest of it, probably the same outcome that we've got right now. So I do think that structural reform of the type that we're talking about in this report, I'm not, in variations on a theme, need to be on the table and need to be considered. But just say one final thing, Andrew, because I think this perhaps brings it alive to people, and why I genuinely believe that local authorities, in whatever manifestation they ultimately become, need to be the guardians of prevention. So in Barking, we were asking ourselves the question for fiscal reasons as well as kind of moral ones, like why were children coming into the care system? And when we sort of peeled back the answer to that question, what we found was that if you were living in a household that was in the private rented sector, if there was low or no income into that household, if that household was in debt, and particularly if that debt was rising rapidly, and if something else big was happening, like a mental health issue or domestic abuse, then that household was 8 times more associated with a child coming into the care system than if those conditions weren't in place. Now, such was the sophistication of our kind of data capability in Barking, is that we could pinpoint all 3,500 households in the borough where those conditions existed. You start asking those questions, and then you start thinking, well, what would be the response of the state to supporting those individuals and families? You get a very, very different pattern of public services. And interestingly enough, almost nothing that we're proposing to go into this public service trust would be affected by that endeavour. You would want to be joining up access to housing, access to domestic abuse services, financial support where it's needed, horizontal integration with mental health and CAMS, absolutely critical. So I guess the point I'm getting to here is that yes, these examples in Barking, in Gateshead, in Salford, in Fife, in Middlesbrough, in Liverpool, there's lots of case studies you can throw a stick at. But the point is that they all either rely on a unique set of individuals pushing something really, really hard. But the question is, are they sustainable without those individuals doing what they're doing? And if you were going to build public services from first principles to address those 5 issues that were going on in the households in Barking, I think you get a very different pattern, which is why I think it's worth we have to keep pushing at this.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Chris. Hilary, just coming to you, I guess. I mean, obviously, feel free to respond to anything that's come up. But I think the other big question people will be asking, and given your kind of your role as former Labour minister, and I know kind of still in touch with a lot of Labour colleagues in the new government as well, is do you think there is a recognition and an appetite to grasp the nettle on some of this, which the last government sort of ducked? Because I thought Angela Rayner's speech to LGA conference was quite ambitious, and she did make some comments around this. Alex Norris, another minister in MHCOG, also was very warm about kind of looking at some of those topic areas. But I guess with your experience in government and knowing, as you said earlier, that we've never really got this right, and it's always been in the too difficult box to fix. Do you think now we finally are reaching the end of the road where politicians will do something about it?
I think that the real problem is there are so many things to fix. Even in what we're talking about, the narrow bits that we're talking about. This is a long-term program. And I think one of the things that we can do is help the government to prioritize what will really make a difference. Part of the problem is that people have always historically said, in order to really change things, you need to, put in a bit of money to calm it, to help the transition. And the problem is they don't have the bit of money to put in to make those transitions. But I am convinced that we have to be, there has been a lot of work done, and Gateshead's one of the places I know about, on evidence-based work. I spent my last job in government when I was at the Cabinet Office also doing social exclusion. And we were simply looking at evidence-based work and how we could persuade people here to do evidence-based work, because the real, people love, we've had this idea, we're going to do this. And they don't want to be constrained by what other people have done and what other people have learned. I think that's one of the real issues that Chris was talking about in the children's area. I did a lot of work. I went to other European countries to see how they did children's social care, and it was very different. And we have in our legislation the basic thing that the state becomes the parent, and it is a disaster. State doesn't do it very well. It's not what the kids want anyway. They want to know and understand what's happened. And I had one key worker in, I think it was Denmark, say to me, we think it's our job to work between what's gone wrong and what the future might be, rather than we take over as parent. And I just thought she was so right. But try and persuade people now that you remove that. I made myself very unpopular in government, trying to persuade the DFE, as it then was, that that's the way they should go. But if we use evidence-based work on longer-term programs, then precisely what Chris is arguing, we could get to. But I do think that the government is looking at how do they rebalance all the funding on public services, because need was taken out, essentially. So I think they are going to re-energize. I don't know, so don't anybody run away and say this is going to happen. How they're going to re-energize the index of multiple deprivation, which we introduced, and how you're actually going to meet that need more. You've got a better needs-based formula but you know, they're not going to be able to radicalize the whole of local government finance, even in the first term. So I think the important thing is working out the priorities, being very clear about what the role of local government is, and actually getting the relationship between the combined authorities and the local authorities more effectively established about different relationships, but also looking at those parts of the country where there isn't a combined authority. Because at the moment we're putting a lot on how do you devolve to the combined authority, and I've been doing a lot of that in the northeast on child poverty. But in terms of how far they're ambitious, but they haven't got the bungs of money. And I'd also say about the trusts, we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes as in the health service, because anybody who is involved in the health service would say we're not a perfect model by a long shot. And financial flows in the health service benefit the crisis in hospitals and undermine the attempt to go to the community and to neighborhoods. And actually, part of the 10-year plan is going to be about how do you shift that. But that will be very unpopular in some parts of the health service, because if you change the financial flows, you actually mean that those hospitals who end up in deficit don't get a bung at the end of the year the way that they do now. And that is the problem about a national funding system with limited accountability at local level.
Some great points there, Hilary. And thanks very much again to all our panelists as well. Really good food for thought. Now, yeah, as Joanne said, we moved to a kind of really rich element of it, the kind of open conversation. So I will take some questions. I'll probably take them in groups of kind of 2 or 3 at a time. That way we can get through as many as possible. We've got one here, one at the back. Anybody else got a question they want to raise? We've got one here in the middle. They're former ex-Demos staff, so I might, you know, we'll see if we get to you. I'm going to also repeat everybody's question just for the online audience. So sorry if that's annoying, but just so they can hear and see what's going on. So just want to say who you are and ask a question.
Yes, Tom Lawrence, TRL Insight and associate for many different organisations. I'll answer Joanne's question about have I read the report. I searched as thoroughly as I could across Demos's website and the rest of the web and couldn't find it. So I'm going to ask questions about its contents, I'm afraid.
It is on the website now, so it went on live this morning.
Searched on the train on the way down, couldn't find it. The public service trusts. What's the governance for those? Are they going to be quangos? Who's leading them, and how are those people accountable? And more broadly, I'm concerned that in that direction we're kind of moving away from the idea of passing power and control down to as close to communities and individuals as we can. And to me, the one thing that you need to unlock that particular key is if councils are to be doing more and have more chance of being properly funded, you need to unlock their ability to raise different types of taxes or have shares of different types of taxes. So I'd like to know what the report says about devolving fiscal choices, if you like, and indeed what it says about how you might change the system, if it says anything about how you might change the system to equalise for different abilities to raise taxes under that new system.
Thank you very much. Yes, Seth.
Tom probably beat me most of it actually, in the sense of great discussion debate. One thing I wasn't wholly clear about in terms of the public service trust was around the structure of governance, the accountability, and how they would also interact with other organisations like ICBs, NHS Trust, etc. So that was my question, because that particularly clear from
Yes.
the rest of the report.
No problem. No, we can definitely get into that. And go on then. Yes, and then.
Yeah, going through the form formerly of this parish and now in local government. Yeah, I guess from being in local government, the thing that you hear a lot of about finances, not just we need more money, is we want kind of more autonomy and kind of really long-term control over finances to be able to properly, strategically plan. And so this report talks about shifting fiscal responsibility and kind of freeing local governments of that. But what's the difference between removing fiscal responsibility in your eyes as the authors of this report and taking away fiscal control? And kind of, or is the unspoken proposition that actually we should take fiscal control away from local authorities? It would be better in the hands of these trusts or in the hands of central governments? Yeah, what's the responsibility and control?
Well, as Andrew and I co-authored it, I mean, I'll pick the easy ones, and then Andrew, maybe you can pick the harder ones. Andrew, why don't you talk about why don't you talk about the shares of taxes and the fiscal side of it, which we do talk a little bit around that, and perhaps that point about Courtney's point about autonomy and so on, and I'll pick up the one around governance and the ICB structures. So, Andrew, fiscal devolution. Well, I mean, the short answer, too long didn't read version is we don't recommend fiscal devolution. We don't talk about that. But Andrew, yes.
Yeah. So the future funding model we suggest for councils is that they should primarily be reliant on council tax, and we do recommend more devolution in the sense of giving councils much more control over council tax. In particular, we recommend removing the referendum-related limits and allowing local authorities to have genuine choice over whether they want to raise council tax by more than that if they want to. So there's some devolution there. We also recommend, to come to your point about equalisation between different areas. So our model is based on council tax plus an equalisation grant based on primarily socioeconomic deprivation. Obviously, you can think about other elements you might want to put into the formula, but we think that should probably be the primary one. And on the autonomy point, I think the proposals in the report are designed to give local authorities genuine autonomy and choice over what they spend money on. And at the moment, many local authorities don't feel that they have that at all. I think to use the example of just social care, because that's the adult children's social care are the two biggest spending areas. Across local authorities in 2010, I think it was about 53% of local authority spending went on those two areas, and that's now gone up to, I think, 67% across all local authorities. In some individual local authorities, it's over 80%. And when you add in homelessness-related spending, that was in London. That was £4 million every day across local authorities in London last year. Though they don't have genuine autonomy or power or choice over most areas. And in fact, I think one of the things we heard speaking to people was that councillors sometimes feel the only genuine choice they have is what things to cut, because you've got all these central government mandates on what you have to spend money on. You must spend money on temporary accommodation. You must spend money on adult social care for anyone who meets the needs test that is set out in national legislation, and the amount of areas that there is genuine discretion over is getting smaller every year. That's also the key point as well. A lot of the discretionary services, discretionary in quotation marks, kind of youth services, Sure Start, even things like fixing potholes in roads, things that have less legal requirements around them. A lot of those things have already been cut or reduced substantially since 2010. So we are running out of road on pursuing that path of cutting discretionary spending while spending on central government mandated services increases every year. Yeah.
And I think also that point about long-termism. I mean, when we talk about high need demand-led services in this paper, effectively we were just talking about this before we started, actually, Joanne. But in your question as well, your answer to your kind of wider comments, a lot of these things are very volatile in terms of prediction. I mean, the councils in this room where homelessness spike in demand in that, or particularly as you say, complex children and needs, and that suddenly blows out the entire budget by kind of creating a little bit of kind of a fiscal firewall around that. You actually create a position where you could be much more long-term in planning what local authorities need, and create multi-year settlements and provide more support and discretion to local authorities to make judgments around that. Whereas when you start throwing in these kind of very complex, unpredictable, high need services, making that kind of long-term fiscal planning does become difficult. And I think, coming back to your point, we don't shy away from this report, the flip side of giving fiscal responsibility to central government is, for some of these services, is that yes, central government will have to make the ultimate choice about how much money goes into them and what the eligibility criteria are. But they already do that right now, except, as you quite rightly say, Joanne, they just blame local authorities for not delivering it when they're the ones setting the goal. So our gamble, and it is a gamble, and there's no, obviously it's counterfactual based on what we got right now, is looking at the NHS, for example. Central government finds it very difficult to not fund the NHS because voters know that ultimately it is accountable for the funding and the settlement of the NHS. On children's social care and adult social care and homelessness and other areas where there is that confusion. I mean, how many press releases do you read where from MHCLG or whatever department it's called at the time, record funding settlement for local authorities? If they've not managed their money properly, that's not our responsibility. And so on. We would try and cut through that and sort of say, well, if social care funding is not sufficient to meet the demands of those local areas, that's because central government has not provided the resources to deliver that. That's a political choice. I mean, the coalition government made that choice. Maybe a Labour government would make a different choice. A future government would make a different choice around that. But at least it's transparent and it's clear. Coming back to the big point which has come up, and I'll get maybe some reflections from the panel about what they think on this whole governance question, is given you're creating fiscal responsibility at a central level, of course you need to make sure there are some elements of control at a central level as well, because otherwise essentially you're just giving a blank check to every area and saying spend whatever you like and the central government will pick up the tab for it. That's just not going to fly politically, and also where's the accountability for that going forward? But we do think there's an absolutely critical role for local authorities in sitting on the boards of these public services trusts, looking at the appointment of the directors or those that are responsible for the delivery of that. So a bit like when you have kind of police and crime commissioners at the moment, where they have some oversight over the chief constable's appointments and others, you could introduce some democratic and accountability and scrutiny mechanisms there. In terms of their actual governance, a lot of that will depend on the services that they end up delivering. I mean, we do recommend in this one, this report, looking at children's social care and adult social care, particularly at the beginning. Send is another area of demand which you could include into that. Homelessness spend is another area. But whatever you want to make sure that all the actors that have a particular interest in that area, whether that is local police services, the NHS, local authorities, schools, and academy trusts in their place, bringing those together and creating effective governance mechanisms there is important. But ultimately, yes, I mean, if central government is picking up the tab, it needs to have an ultimate ability to control the overall spending elements, envelopes, and the kind of structure of delivery in those places. But we don't want to remove the local voice element. And to some extent, you can strengthen that voice element if you're not involved in delivery as well, because from a local authority perspective, it can be quite complex to balance, what is the voice and the views of local residents with the fact that you've got certain statutory responsibilities and mandates that you have to deliver. This would sort of make it a bit cleaner. The responsibility of local authorities around the PST board would be just to stand up for their local residents and reflect on what they're seeing on the ground, rather than having to also in their head carry the challenging difficulty of making those tough decisions about the funding and the allocation and so on that can come from that. But in terms of the ICB point, which referenced, I think in 50 years' time, when we look back at the ICBs, it was a big mistake to just put health in a bucket on its own and create an integrated care service, but then not integrated with the rest of the public service sector. And I think what we're trying to do a bit with PSTs is almost create a body where you could merge with ICBs in the future, and you could create genuine total place style funding pots and pools at a local level that cuts across a wide range of service delivery areas. But you can't get there overnight, and you need to build up over time, and that's why we talk about sequencing in this report, and there would need to be consultation and alignment. But eventually, you should be trying to bring health and care and skills and education, all these things together, and sort of housing, and as Chris kind of mentioned from their experience, all these kind of overlapping service areas, you do want to bring them back together at some point. But if you just put them straight into ICBs now, we did think about that, of course. I mean, you could just transfer all these responsibilities straight into ICBs today. But as Hilary quite rightly says, the acute trusts dominate them, and all you'd see is a big sucking sound of money going straight out of those services direct into hospitals. So we need to create something which is a countervailing power big enough so that when it sits around the table with the health service, it doesn't get dominated by it. And we think the PSTs could be the star of a model there. But just kind of broadening it out to the kind of panel in terms of governance. I mean, what should be the local role of kind of local government when it comes to accountability for some of these high need services? Because at the moment, I guess it's, government sets a lot of statutory responsibilities, it provides some funding to meet those, but essentially it asks local authority areas to kind of subsidise and ensure the sustainability of those local activities. That the accountability is a bit unclear, really. I mean, local authorities are legally responsible for them, but we know in reality central government funding determines what can be done there. Is this issue of governance? Do we need to be doing something to kind of clarify the ultimate role and responsibility of local authorities when it comes to the quality of service delivery? And I guess from the Public Services Trust, we're trying to take some of that accountability away, and some of that governance away, but we see that as part of the kind of overall financial shift. Has anyone got any thoughts on governance and the role of local authorities on that? Otherwise, I can go back to the audience, but just want to give people a chance to feed in. Chris, yes, sorry, the panelists are pointing at you. Do you have thoughts about governance?
Well, I suppose look, what I like about this report is it keeps posing, if not this, what? And it seems to me there are broadly two ways in which the sector can respond to this. Either they go, no, this is bunkum, and what we want is far greater fiscal devolution, but that can only come if the Treasury are prepared to let go of big decisions around tax and spend, and if government is prepared to allow local government to take on greater service responsibility. And that's a big ask. And I can't imagine a scenario where that would be palatable without some deep reform of local government itself, which then immediately throws into sharp relief these questions about accountability. The dual polity, I think you referred to in the report. I think that was just demonstrating I have read it. So that's one proposition. I suppose what this proposition does is to say, actually, no, look, what is the sort of defining characteristic of local authorities as we approach the mid 20th century? And I, for one, think that is they are incredibly well placed to fulfill a role in relation to prevention. I think they could conceivably take on responsibilities from other parts of the state in relation to that, in relation to employment and skills, in relation to a much more direct commissioning and much tighter day-to-day partnership with parts of primary health and the non-acute end of mental health and CAMS. If the quid pro quo of that is that once people meet a threshold, that the responsibility for supporting those individuals passes to an organisation that has accountability, like three-dimensional accountability to government, to the local state, and potentially to kind of other parts of the public sector, then I think that's a quid pro quo worth exploring. And yes, it's messy and complicated, but what we've got now is messy and complicated. And I don't think it's that transparent. I mean, I genuinely think if people understood how much of their council tax goes on things that they think it goes on versus what it actually goes on, and the extent to which local politicians and, dare I say, chief executives are pretty powerless to do anything about that, then I think people would be horrified. And these said riots on the streets, but we shouldn't joke about these things anymore, should we? But I think that's a long way of saying, like what we've got now isn't working. And I think it's either you go very hard for very significant fiscal devolution, but with that comes responsibility for a whole part of the apparatus of the state that currently is not sitting with local government. If I'm a betting man, I don't think that's where anyone's head's at. And therefore, if that's not the world we're in, then it feels to me that really concentrating and asking and then answering the question posed in this paper, which is what must local government be for? Where does proximity to people, where does building relationships of trust, where does deep integration and co-production with the community and voluntary sector, where is that essential for people to live the good life? If you answer that question, then I think you answer the question, what must local government be for? And I think that would be a valuable thing to do. Well, I would say finally to the sector is like be careful what you wish for when you pull this thread around finance reform, because like it's not the answer is not going to be the status quo with more money, as I think this report's demonstrated.
Thanks, Chris. Some really good points. Yes, got one question here. Got one online as well, and I'll take one here, and then I'll come to you as well. Yes.
Oh, hi. I'm Carol Humpton. I'm the Chief Executive of Quorum, which is the first and longest continuing children's charity, so therefore remembers before any of this was invented. I wanted to draw a couple of observations and then ask a question. The first observation is that the trends seem to be, to me, much more predictable and predicted than is convenient. Secondly, that the National Audit Office report of 2019, which was pre-pandemic, specifically addressed the question of growing demand in children's social care and identified that 50% of the unacceptable variation in both access and quality of services could be accounted for by economic and demographic factors and that the rest could not. I find that a particularly hopeful finding because it means that we're the people we've been waiting for and we can jolly well do something about it, irrespective of these other issues. And it seems to me that lots of conversations about structural reform has very little evidence in my neck of the woods of making any improvement whatsoever to the accountability to our children in a situation where children are in the smallest minority of the British population in history and where £12 billion has moved away from them in the period of the Triple Lock. So what I wonder is whether actually the point that was made earlier is the right one, which is that we should not be thinking so much about structures as thinking about financial incentives. At the moment, the incentive, which is support a child younger, isn't done. There's structural age inequality, in fact, for children in mental health services and in many other things. And that the time scale of the child is very rarely a factor in decision making. So financial incentives over structural reform, question mark?
Thank you very much. Sorry, there was a gentleman here. Was it you? Yes. Sorry, who had the question? Hand? Did you put your hand up, didn't you? You did, and then you did. Yes. So, do you want to go next?
Yeah, that's more kind of government information needed for membership organisation. I'm interested in whether you looked at other countries and how local finance is organised elsewhere. There's something that we've done a bit of work about on in the recent past, and I think particularly it occurred to me with your focus on council tax as mentioned, the driving change here. What we've seen in several other countries that where this works quite well, there's a basket, a sort of mix at the local area and local authorities or regional tiers or whatever it is to have a level of autonomy to sort of flex and mix that basket according to local circumstances. I think there are certain lot of instruments that we tend to focus on when we have this kind of debate. We've had pilots around things like business rates and so on, and council tax referendums and all these kinds of things which can work in some areas, but we know don't work universally, and it's a really difficult question that we grapple with to try to square the circle of how it would be universal when actually it's probably not the right answer, and we shouldn't be looking for a single answer. It's about a complex mix. So that's one element that we've seen in a few other countries that seems to work quite well, and I wonder if there were any other places that you looked at outside of England, outside of the UK.
Well, Chris is already doing a case study for us in France, actually. So he can maybe give us some live reporting there. Did you manage to go to the Dordogne or anywhere like that? No. Akash.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Akash Bhatt, Government. I'm just interested in your model of public service trust and the form of this sector, where you see the join up or involvement of mayoral combined authority to bring public attention. I haven't had a chance to read the paper, so answer maybe in black and white in there. Because I mean, clearly, MCAs have been primarily concerned with economic growth. To go back to your kind of categorization, there's an increasing debate about whether the next phase of devolution to that tier should be around public service devolution. You can already see it in the way quite a lot, I think, of the leading mayors, King Guinness, to kind of conceive of their role. They definitely are seeking to take on functions and play that kind of strategic role around things like, for example, homelessness and public health issues, child poverty, etc., etc. So yeah, just
Well, I mean, on the combined authorities, if you like this demos report, we're open to more work on what the combined authority reform should look like. So thanks, Akat. We'll come to you. Maybe we can get some partnership going. We actually do have a paper coming out a series of papers coming out as part of our Future Public Services Task Force, which will be launching in December. We are going to be looking at exactly this point around combined authorities and some of their role, and linking into this report, we think that Public Services Trust could be an institutional partner for combined authorities. And actually, if you can take out some of the constitutional quote unquote implications of where legal responsibilities currently sit for some of these services and create an entity which then can be restructured and amended depending on what the future relationship with combined authorities are, you could make that easier than the current model, where essentially you're relying on it's quite a political conversation, I guess, in the sense that what's a relationship that the new mayors will have with leaders of local authorities and how they will collaborate around some of that public service delivery. That's quite unpredictable. So actually PSTs could create a bit more stability when it comes to the responsibility, because if it's getting if the fiscal responsibility and the ultimate kind of spending setting is getting taken out of local authorities for those high need acute services and being pulled into PSTs, that could be something which then creates much more stable partners for combined authorities to work with. But so we will be looking at that. So please do read that report when it comes out. But we are actually thinking of what the future of combined authorities would be on the basis of some of our recommendations and exploring that piece. Andrew, I might ask you to talk about other countries' examples in a moment, but I guess maybe Joanne and Hilary and Chris, this kind of question was asked at the beginning and posed around financial incentives and structures. Is that something we should be looking much more carefully? I mean, Hilary, you sort of mentioned in your opening remarks, you think that was something you did explore actually, in thinking about how do you reward good outcomes and incentivize system for good outcomes. We didn't talk about a huge amount about that in this paper, but is that something that's kind of being underlooked at the moment in terms of its potential to perhaps lead to public service reform and improvements? I mean, Hilary, do you want to kick us off on that?
Well, what I can say with some confidence is that there's not going to be much structural reform on anything at the moment, because that takes money and time which the current government does not have. And if you think about ICBs, there's a load of pressure to do something about ICBs, to do something about NHSE, and so on, because everybody thinks all of that was just handled in a way it shouldn't have been. If I give the example on ICBs in the Northeast, partly because it's Liam Donaldson in the chair, they've gone back to the old region. So it's all 12 authorities in the Northeast, plus from Scotland down to Yorkshire, it's all 12 authorities plus North Cumbria. And if you go to Essex, somebody from Essex down to here, is it three ICBs or two? But it's at least two. There are however many in London. So nobody knows whether the ICB is meant to reflect place, meant to reflect identity of need, or whatever. Nobody has a clue. And they've all been developed separately, individually, and so on. And that actually means their role and their work with local government becomes quite challenging. But I can tell you, there ain't going to be there's not the bandwidth to do the structural reform. And that might be something people think about for the future, but not for this Parliament. But the whole thing about what is local government for is really important. And what do we mean by place? And what are the elements of place that really are going to challenge the way we work? And it does mean that for me, if you're going to move to longer term, outcome-based, evidence-based policy, then financial incentives will have a role. And I want to see much more evidence-based policy, and that means looking at outcomes. And I just think that we need to get our heads around that and see how different that is to where we are now, and how do we actually move that.
Joanne, incentives. I mean, this I think SIPFA's looked at. I mean, is there more we could be doing to kind of reward that long-term investment and kind of effective delivery of public services and the kind of financial contribution that's made to local authorities?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly more that we can do. I think that when you're talking about structural change, and I do think, over the years we do love a bit of structural change, don't we? And the one thing I would say that we don't do very well on the other side of that is monitoring, evaluation, and understanding what worked. I mean, if we went back and had a look over the last 15 years of all the different sort of boards we've had and LEPs and I could name dozens of them. We move on to the next great and exciting thing, and what we don't do, and this is a criticism across all government, is that because you're looking ahead, nobody then turns and goes, right, we've done that. Did it get results?
There was a very good NAA report on that last year.
Oh, there you go. So I do think that from your comment about we change structure very quickly, sometimes it's really expensive, because it's not just about structure, it's about culture. Just because you've put in a structure of something, you've got the people, quite often the same people or similar people. There's a cultural thing, and culture is a much longer change. But I do think that we need a much better monitoring and evaluation system to understand what's happened before. Because to be fair, very few of the things people suggest are new in the truest sense of the word. They might have a new title and things around them are the same, and they're digital rather than analog. But fundamentally, very few things are really, really different. So my comment to that would be, I think we, and that's a big we, need to spend a bit of time and be prepared to learn, evaluate from what we've learned before, and take those lessons and then save ourselves thousands and thousands of pounds.
Thanks, Joanne. And we actually, again, not to plug again the Future Public Services Task Force, which we will launch some papers on soon, but we do look at outcomes-based funding models there. And there's been some really interesting work done with the Life Chances Fund in Kirklees, for example, and some of the outcomes-based partnerships they've created. So there are models of incentivizing outcomes-based approaches, which seem to be generating some interesting results. And we should probably do some further investigations and thinking about that. But we definitely think that there's a big role to play in the future delivery of public services there. Andrew, just very quickly on international examples, because I'm conscious of testing people's patience because we're slightly overrunning. Yes, other countries abroad, overseas, is there lessons to be learned there?
Yeah, I think we did look at some other countries. As you will know, many of my sources were your reports, so thank you for producing them. But it's quite difficult to compare other countries because there are so many different kind of complexities. I think, just to come back to a theme that we've discussed a lot already, we really think that the purpose of local government, the role of local authorities, is really key. And our argument for local authorities taking that kind of local role, that kind of local democracy and that place leadership role, it means that it implies that local authorities should be based around kind of people's communities and identities and so on. That implies kind of generally probably smaller local authorities to represent areas that people identify with, and that in turn means that council tax is actually quite a good tax to rely on, we think, for that reason, because it is a property-based tax that for people who live in the local area. In our model, there's a very direct link between council tax and neighbourhood and cultural services and community centres and libraries. You know, the things that people think that councils spend the money on, that is what councils would be doing in our vision. So we think actually that kind of link can really strengthen the kind of accountability between local voters paying council tax and local authorities, which is really broken at the moment because council tax is used to fund social care to a large degree, and therefore because of that, we also don't think that we need to provide other kind of income streams to local authorities specifically, because we think that council tax plus a grant to equalise between areas would be sufficient for the purpose of local authorities that we are proposing. Whereas I think if you have a vision of a local authority, or we suggest a combined authority, for example, where its purpose is to grow the local economy, there's I think a stronger argument to be made about tying that into more kind of fiscal devolution or sharing the proceeds of growth, or however you want to describe it.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And just to conclude, so thank you all very much to our panelists for great contributions and great questions here. We did have a question online, which was, what do you think the appetite from local government to these ideas will be? Which I think is a great moment to end on, which I suppose is, well, we hope the appetite will be one which is interested in that debate, which we've all been talking about here. And I think Chris really kind of neatly summed it up. You know, we know that a lot of proposals in this paper are very provocative. They ask some big questions, some fundamental questions, but we need to start coming up with some answers. And if not this, something else. And, you know, there are lots of different pathways. There is a federalist, fiscally devolved future that you could look at. There is a steady as she goes future. We're just tweaking the grant mechanisms, and as kind of been mentioned, maybe adding baskets of new taxes and new revenue streams. There's this option which is a bit more fiscally centralizing in terms of responsibility, but trying to look at how you can kind of connect different public services together and you know, look at reform from that direction. But whatever it is, I think that's, as we said at the conclusion of the paper, we can't go on as we are. We need to do something different, and we hope that local government's response to this paper will be to see it as the start of a debate, which I do think Hillary's quite right to say probably won't be answered in this Parliament, but needs to be answered in the years to come, which is, what is the purpose for local government in the 21st century? How do you design a fiscal regime that enables it to do what it does best? And how do you make sure that risk is shared fairly and proportionally throughout the system, and that we don't keep coming back to crisis after crisis and lurching from one mistake to another? But really appreciate everybody's attendance. Thank you again to London Borough of Havering for supporting us in this work and being great support to us. Thank you very much to SIPFA, WEA, Institute for Employability Professionals and Read in Partnership, who enabled this network to take place. And we conclude by giving a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you. And feel free to mingle if you'd like to do so, and look forward to seeing you at one of our events in the future.